So what if the most fundamental skills you've been taught about persuading people are just, well, what if they're actually destroying your chances of success?
Right, especially when the stakes are really high.
Exactly. I mean, have you ever delivered what felt like a totally flawless pitch and you have the other person nodding along, answering your questions, and then nothing? They just ghost you.
Oh, yeah. It's incredibly frustrating. You walk away thinking you absolutely nailed the presentation, but that commitment just, you know, it never materializes.
And it happens every single day, right? In corporate boardrooms, major sales deals, even in like high stakes personal discussion.
It really does. And for decades, the conventional wisdom was basically that if you didn't get that final yes, you just didn't close hard enough, or you failed to handle their objections properly.
But the research we're getting into today just completely shatters that whole conventional wisdom. We're doing a deep dive into this methodology from a book called Suspin Selling by Neil Rackham.
Yeah, and Rackham provides this hard empirical proof that the classic persuasion tactics we all instinctively use, they actually trigger psychological resistance, at least in major complex decisions.
Right, which is why today's deep dive is so crucial, whether you're, selling enterprise software or pitching a massive project to an executive board or even just trying to convince your partner to move across the country.
Exactly. If the situation involves a really significant commitment of time, money, or risk, that old playbook is just completely obsolete.
So we should probably start by contextualizing the sheer scale of the source material here, because we aren't just looking at one charismatic guru's personal theories.
No, not at all. This is based on the Huthwaite studies, which
Mhm.
is arguably the most exhaustive scientific study ever done on face-to-face business behaviors.
Yeah, the parameters of this project are just wild. It cost over $1 million, right?
Over $1 million,
Yeah.
and it spanned 12 uninterrupted years. Rackham's team systematically analyzed over 35,000 individual sales transactions across 27 different countries.
That is just a staggering amount of data. And they didn't just look at the final revenue numbers, did they?
No, they had trained researchers physically sitting in the room during these interactions. They were meticulously coding and tracking every single behavioral variable.
Like how often specific phrases were used or the exact timing of when a solution was introduced.
Exactly. They wanted to determine mathematically what correlated with success and what correlated with failure.
There's this incredible story in the source material that I think perfectly captures the whiplash this data caused when it first came out.
Oh, the Chicago VP story. Yeah, that one is
It's
classic.
so good. So it's the late 1970s, right? And Rackham is sitting in a boardroom with the vice president of sales for this massive Fortune 100 company in Chicago.
Right, and this organization was heavily invested in traditional sales training. They spent millions teaching their people aggressive closing techniques and objection handling.
But their sales were lagging, like 30% behind projections. So the VP brings Rackham's researchers in to ride along with his reps and basically figure out where the leak is.
And the VP is fully expecting Rackham's multi-million-dollar research engine to just validate the training he's been forcing on his people.
Right. He assumed his superstars, the ones actually hitting their quotas, were just naturally more aggressive closers.
Yeah, he thought they were these verbal acrobats who could handle any objection, and that they used all these open-ended questions to keep the buyer talking.
So then Rackham stands up, presents the findings, and just drops an absolute anvil on the room. He tells this table of executives that the top performers actually used fewer closing techniques than the reps who failed.
Which is mind-blowing. The aggressive, always-be-closing mentality was actually inversely correlated with success in their major account.
And then he takes it even further. He totally dismantles their objection handling module, right?
Yep. He showed them that the top performers didn't have better objection handling skills because they were facing significantly fewer objections in the first place.
Wait, so they weren't just better at arguing?
No. Their behavior proactively prevented the objections from ever even coming up.
That is wild. And the final revelation, which I think just upends decades of communication theory, there was zero statistical difference between using open-ended questions versus closed-ended questions.
Exactly. The worst performers use just as many open questions as the top performers.
I can only imagine the air just completely getting sucked out of that boardroom. I mean, Rackham took the holy trinity of 20th century persuasion closing, overcoming objections, and open-ended questions, and basically said, none of it matters.
He told a Fortune 100 executive team that their entire philosophy had no bearing on their major deals. It's like walking into a room of structural engineers and saying, gravity works backward on Tuesdays.
Yeah, and the VP was indignant, right? because he pointed out that this exact methodology was the bedrock training for companies like IBM, Xerox, AT&T, all the corporate titans back then.
He was furious. From his perspective, those traditional skills were undeniably generating revenue for those companies.
So that friction is really the core mystery Rackham set out to solve. Why did those classic tactics work so brilliantly sometimes, but fail so catastrophically for complex, major accounts?
Well, the root of that cognitive dissonance goes all the way back to the 1920s. There was a researcher named E.K. Strong who published pioneering work on sales psychology.
Well, he's the one who introduced the concepts we still talk about today. Features versus benefits, closing strategies, objection handling.
Exactly. But Strong's models were built entirely on low-value single-call transactions. He was analyzing the psychology of selling encyclopedias door to door.
Or like hawking an overhead projector to a school principal.
Right. And for 60 years, the business world just mindlessly copy-pasted that model, scaling it up and assuming it applied to complex, multi-million-dollar corporate mergers.
They just figured a large decision is just a small decision with more zeros attached to it.
And that assumption is the fatal flaw the Huthwaite data exposes. Rackham's central thesis is that success in major sales demands an entirely different psychological framework than a small transaction.
Right, because as the magnitude of the decision gets bigger, the traditional strategies don't just, like, lose their effectiveness, they actively alienate the decision maker.
They trigger defensive psychological mechanisms that completely kill the deal.
I love the strategic analogy for this. It's like applying 1920s small sale tactics to a modern corporate deal is like trying to use checkers strategy to win a chess match.
Oh, that's a perfect way to put it.
Right, because you look down, the board looks kind of similar.
Yeah.
It's got alternating squares, you're sliding pieces around, but the rules of engagement, the cascading consequences of a single aggressive move, they're entirely different.
If you just push pieces forward aggressively in chess the way you do in checkers,
Yeah.
a sophisticated opponent is going to dismantle your position in 3 moves.
Exactly. So let's break down why that psychology diverges so sharply between a minor choice and a major commitment. Because there are a few critical variables here, right?
Yes, 3 main ones. The first critical variable is the length of the decision cycle.
Because a major strategic decision is almost never made in a single room on a single afternoon.
Exactly. A low-value transaction usually wraps up in one interaction. The psychological tension is resolved right then and there with the seller standing in front of you.
So if someone is super charismatic and has a polished pitch, they can just overwhelm your natural hesitation temporarily.
Right. They force a spike in enthusiasm, extract a quick yes, and leave with the contract before that enthusiasm fades away.
But complex decisions require multiple meetings, right? Spread over weeks or months or even years.
It means the actual point of decision, the moment they actually decide to allocate the funds, almost always happens when the persuader isn't even in the room.
Wow, yeah. The human brain just cannot sustain that artificial enthusiasm from a slick presentation for that long.
It evaporates within 48 hours. So in a multi-call cycle, the buyer has to internalize the justification for the change well enough to defend it to themselves.
And more importantly, to other skeptical stakeholders when you're long gone.
Exactly. If you apply a pushy, hard-close methodology on day one, you might create temporary pressure, but the buyer will just refuse to take your second meeting so they don't have to experience that pressure again.
That makes so much sense. And that feeds directly into the second massive differentiator, the value equation.
Right, the perceived risk matrix.
Yeah, because if I'm buying a $15 gadget at an airport kiosk, I'm not doing deep existential soul searching. If it breaks, I throw it in the trash. The risk is negligible.
But if you are a corporate director advocating for a $2 million software implementation, the perceived risk is staggering.
You're not just looking at the financial cost, you're calculating the operational nightmare of implementing it, the public visibility of the project.
And the visceral fear that if you champion a platform that fails, you could severely damage your career.
Right. So for a major commitment to clear that hurdle, the perceived seriousness of the problem has to profoundly outweigh the massive cost of the solution.
And that ties into the third variable, the ongoing relationship. Rackham shares this really brilliant anecdote in the sources about buying an overhead projector versus a $70,000 computer system.
Oh, on the exact same day, right?
Yes, he needed the projector immediately, And the rep who showed up was a walking stereotype of sleazy, high-pressure tactics.
But Rackham bought it anyway.
He did. The price was fine, it met his immediate need, and the crucial factor was that he knew he would never have to interact with that aggressive salesperson ever again.
Right, but then later that afternoon, he evaluated the expensive computer system, and the salesperson for that was perfectly pleasant, right?
Much better than the projector rep. Maybe a bit overly eager, but perfectly fine. Yet, Rackham found himself hesitating.
Because in a high-stakes decision, you're not just buying a tangible asset. You're entering into a protracted, complex relationship with the seller and their whole organization.
Exactly. There will be months of integration, troubleshooting, and support. The buyer instinctively knows they can't isolate the product from the people providing it.
So if the stakes, the timeline, and the relationship dynamics make those old tactics basically toxic, we have to look at how to actually navigate this chessboard.
Right, and the Huthwaite researchers categorized every single interaction into 4 distinct phases.
Preliminaries, investigating, demonstrating capability, and obtaining commitment.
Yes, and the disparity between where traditional training focuses and where actual success is generated is just stark.
Because historically, sales training obsessively targets the back half of that timeline, right?
Exactly. Reps spend weeks learning how to demonstrate capability, which is the pitch, and obtaining commitment, which is the close.
But the data from those 35,000 interactions revealed something totally different. The investigating stage is the sole definitive predictor of whether a major complex sale will succeed or fail.
The data is unambiguous on this. The investigating stage, when you're asking questions, mapping their reality, uncovering underlying needs that dictates the outcome.
So the higher the volume of targeted questions asked, the higher the probability of success.
Statistically, yes.
Okay, I have to push back on this a little bit, or at least play devil's advocate for that Chicago VP, because I struggle to believe that top performers don't rely heavily on open-ended questions.
It's a tough pill to swallow because of how ingrained it is.
Right. Every communication course, journalism seminar, therapy framework, they all preach that open-ended questions are the key to getting people to open up. Are you really telling me that after analyzing 35,000 calls, the grammatical structure of the question has absolutely zero impact?
The data forces us to look at the cognitive load of the buyer rather than the grammatical theory of the seller. That dogma about open questions dates all the way back to 1925.
I mean, the theoretical logic seems sound, doesn't it? Open questions invite elaboration, closed questions shut down the dialogue.
It sounds perfectly logical. But when Huthwaite ran the actual regressions on live corporate interactions, the correlation completely vanished. Top performers asked just as many closed questions as bottom performers.
Wow. So if grammar isn't the metric of success, then the metric has to be the psychological state that the question induces in the buyer.
That is the crucial pivot right there. Successful persuaders discard the artificial anxiety over whether a question starts with how or do you.
They just evaluate a question based on its strategic purpose.
Yeah, exactly. They are hyper-focused on uncovering and developing the buyer's needs, regardless of whether that takes a one-word confirmation or a 10-minute monologue to achieve.
So if the entire game is won or lost in the investigation of needs, we really need to define what a need actually is here. Because Rackham draws a massive line in the sand, splitting needs into 2 distinct categories.
Yes, implied needs and explicit needs. And this distinction is the engine that drives the entire methodology.
So let's unpack those. What's an implied need?
Rackham defines an implied need as a clear statement of a problem, a difficulty, or dissatisfaction with the status quo.
Okay, so like a facility manager saying, our current sorting machine jams too frequently, or we're having quality control failures.
Exactly. Those are implied needs.
So an implied need is basically just a complaint. It's an acknowledgement of friction.
Right. Now, an explicit need represents a completely different cognitive state. It's a clear, unambiguous statement of a want, a desire, or an intention to take action.
So that would sound more like, we need a sorting mechanism that processes 1,000 units an hour without jamming.
Yes, or we are actively looking for a software integration to reduce our quality control failures by 15%.
Got it. So complaining about a problem is entirely different from asking for a specific solution. They're 2 different psychological postures. But why does categorizing them matter so much in practice?
It matters because of the value equation we talked about earlier. In a minor, low-stakes transaction, uncovering an implied need is entirely sufficient to trigger a purchase.
Like the headache example. If I say, I have a terrible headache, that's an implied need.
And if you immediately offer them a $5 painkiller, they will buy it without hesitation. The severity of the minor problem easily justifies the negligible cost.
But the fatal trap is treating a $1 million corporate deal like a $5 headache.
Precisely. In a high-stakes environment, an implied need does not predict a successful outcome.
So if you're trying to sell a $200,000 piece of industrial equipment, and the plant manager casually mentions, our current machine is a bit difficult for the new operators to use.
And you immediately pounce and say, our new model is incredibly intuitive and it only costs $200,000.
Oh.
You've instantly lost credibility.
Because a minor operational annoyance just doesn't carry the psychological weight to justify a massive capital expenditure.
Exactly. The source material actually highlights an agonizing example of this with a junior telecommunications seller.
Oh, right, the guy who thought he struck gold.
Yeah. He secures a meeting with a decent-sized account, runs through his initial questions, and the client casually admits they experienced some bandwidth capacity problems during morning peak hours.
So the young seller hears that complaint, his eyes light up, and he immediately launches into his pitch.
He demonstrates his high-capacity solution, leaves the office, and tells his manager he had a spectacular meeting with massive buying signals.
And a week later, he loses the deal entirely.
Because he suffered from a fundamental misdiagnosis. He hallucinated an explicit need where only an implied need existed.
He thought the mere existence of a baseline problem was enough to override the immense cost and disruption of his solution.
But elite persuaders operate on a completely different psychological wavelength. When they hear an implied need, they don't immediately pitch. They recognize it's just raw material.
So the real skill is taking that raw material, that minor dissatisfaction, and methodically amplifying it, right? Adding weight to it until it breaches critical mass and transforms into an explicit need.
Exactly. And the mechanism for achieving that transformation is the SBN framework.
Which is this specific sequential architecture of investigative questions. Let's walk through it. Begins with the S situation questions.
Situation questions are designed to gather neutral background facts, context, and operational baselines.
Like, what logistical software are you currently running? Or, how many distribution centers do you manage?
Right. These questions are functionally necessary to map the terrain, but the statistical analysis revealed a severe warning regarding their usage.
Basically, they are actively toxic to the relationship if you overuse them.
Very much so. Inexperienced professionals lean heavily on situation questions because they provide an illusion of safety.
Yeah, you feel like you're driving the conversation forward without risking any emotional friction. You're just safely collecting data points.
But we have to evaluate this from the cognitive perspective of the buyer. Does a busy senior executive get any value out of explaining their own organizational chart to an outside vendor?
No. It's the professional equivalent of being trapped on a horrendous first date.
That's a great analogy.
You sit down, and the other person just starts interrogating you with demographic trivia. Where do you work? How long is your commute? Do you have siblings?
The cognitive tax is entirely on you, while the benefit is entirely for them. It is profoundly boring.
It just drains the energy right out of the room. So the practical takeaway here is rigorous pre-call planning.
Right, absolutely. In the modern era, with unparalleled access to corporate data, there is zero justification for consuming a decision-maker's valuable time asking questions you could have resolved with a quick web search.
So top performers deploy situation questions with surgical precision just to gather specific non-public context, and then they swiftly advance to the P in the framework.
Problem questions.
This shifts the spotlight. We're moving from neutral facts to difficulties, friction points, and dissatisfactions.
The questioning shifts to things like, are you satisfied with the latency of your current servers? Or, is it difficult to process your end-of-month reconciliation with the existing headcount?
And the Huthwaite regressions show that problem questions are significantly more correlated with success than situation questions.
Right, because the psychological dynamic changes. You are finally discussing a topic that holds intrinsic value to the client, their own operational friction.
In small-scale sales, a high volume of problem questions actually correlates strongly with closing the deal.
But the data also shows that in a major sale, uncovering the problem is merely establishing a beachhead.
You deploy problem questions to locate the dissatisfaction. But if you stop there and immediately prescribe your solution, you fall right back into that telecommunications seller's trap.
Which necessitates the transition to the I in the CISPIN architecture. This is the absolute powerhouse of the major sale.
The psychological fulcrum that tips the entire negotiation. Implication questions.
Yes. This is where the methodology elevates from simple data gathering to high-level psychological strategy.
You've asked your problem questions. The client has admitted to an implied need, a minor pain point. The amateur senses blood in the water and attacks with a product pitch.
But the master investigator deliberately holds back. They suppress the urge to solve the problem.
Why? Because the problem simply isn't big enough yet. It doesn't carry enough mass on the value equation scale to justify the disruption of buying.
Exactly. Implication questions are designed to rigorously explore the downstream effects, the cascading consequences, and the hidden costs of a problem.
They take an issue that the decision maker currently thinks of as a minor annoyance and systematically magnify it into a massive, interconnected crisis.
A crisis that demands immediate, urgent intervention. The source material provides a clinical breakdown of how this sounds in practice with a factory manager scenario.
Oh, let's walk through that. Imagine I'm the factory manager and you ask me a baseline problem question.
Okay, are your current sorting machines difficult for the floor operators to configure?
And I shrug and say, yeah, the interface is a bit archaic and hard to use, but we manage. So that's an implied need. The dissatisfaction exists, but the urgency is low.
Right. Now, if I'm an amateur, I immediately trigger my pitch. I say, our new machines feature a state-of-the-art touchscreen interface that is incredibly easy to use.
And I would inevitably respond, that sounds nice, but I'm not authorizing a $150,000 capital expenditure just because the current buttons are a bit sticky.
The pitch fails because the solution outweighs the perceived pain. But the master investigator ignores the solution entirely and deploys implication questions to explore the blast radius of that archaic interface.
Okay, so how would you ask that?
I might ask, you mentioned the machines are hard to configure. If you only have a handful of veteran operators who fully understand the quirks of that interface, doesn't that create severe workflow bottlenecks if one of them calls in sick?
And I'm forced to consider the consequence. I'd say, well, yes. If a senior operator's out, we usually have a localized backlog while a supervisor steps in to configure the run.
Then I press the implication further. What effect does that specific localized backlog have on your daily production quotas?
It introduces lag. We probably miss our daily target by a few percentage points on those days.
And if you are consistently missing daily production targets, how is that impacting your weekly overtime expenditures trying to catch up?
And then I connect the dots. The overtime budget has been bleeding heavily this quarter. It's becoming a serious issue with finance.
And with your floor staff constantly working unpredictable overtime just to fight archaic machinery, is that contributing to operator fatigue and increased turnover rate?
Actually, it is. We've lost 3 highly trained operators this month, and they all cited burnout in their exit interviews.
Boom. In just 4 sequential questions, the entire landscape of the negotiation has been terraformed.
It's incredible. We began with a minor interface complaint. The buttons are hard to use, but by relentlessly pulling the thread of consequences, you linked it to production bottlenecks, massive financial bleeding, and an HR crisis.
Suddenly, a $150,000 machine doesn't look like an expensive luxury. It looks like a vital rescue operation.
We fundamentally tipped the value equation. The gravity of the problem now massively outweighs the financial cost.
It is a masterful demonstration of guided cognitive dissonance. And the brilliance of the implication question is that the seller never once lectured the buyer about how terrible their factory was running.
You didn't aggressively attack my competence at all. You just asked highly targeted questions that forced me to internally calculate the severity of my own situation.
And the Huthwaite regressions overwhelmingly demonstrate that senior decision makers respond exceptionally well to implication questions because these questions operate purely in the language of business logic.
Cause, effect, operational risk, financial consequence. But Rackham also illustrates how universally human the psychology is with a low-stakes example from his own life, right?
Oh, the car analogy, yes. He's having a casual conversation with a friend about the friend's car.
He asks a baseline situation or problem question, and the friend says, it's not bad. It's getting older, but it reliably gets me from point A to point B. The friend is totally content.
Absolutely no explicit desire to purchase a new vehicle. But Rackham, acting like an elite investigator, begins deploying implication questions.
He notes the age of the car and asks, your car has to be at least 7 years old. Doesn't that mean you've aged out of claiming the depreciation on it for your business taxes?
The friend pauses and says, I suppose that's mathematically true.
So Rackham follows the thread. So you are effectively losing a couple of $1,000s a year in tax write-offs just by holding on to it.
The friend admits he hadn't calculated that, so Rackham pivots to operational risk.
And with a 7-year-old model, isn't it becoming increasingly difficult to source replacement parts from the manufacturer?
The friend concedes it took his mechanic 2 months to locate a specific part recently, and then Rackham delivers the final implication. Wouldn't it be incredibly detrimental to your business if the car suffered a catastrophic breakdown while you were out of state meeting a client and you were physically stranded for weeks waiting for a part?
Within a 5-minute span, the friend who was totally satisfied initially suddenly says, I'm really beginning to wonder if it's time to upgrade. What new models do you think I should look at?
He literally hallucinated a crisis and convinced himself of the urgent need to buy, entirely driven by the psychological pressure of those questions.
So if you're listening to this and mapping out your next major pitch, the practical mandate here is intense pre-call planning. You cannot reliably invent devastating implication questions on the fly under pressure.
No, you must engineer them in advance. Identify a specific problem you know your product elegantly solves. Write it down and map out 4 to 5 negative downstream consequences.
How does it erode profit margins? How does it damage employee morale, expose them to regulatory risk? Once you map the consequences, reverse engineer those into questions.
But as powerful as this architecture is, it introduces a highly volatile psychological dynamic.
Right, because if you spend 45 minutes relentlessly forcing an executive to confront how terrible their infrastructure is, how much capital they are bleeding, aren't they going to get incredibly defensive and depressed?
Exactly. Human beings possess a finite tolerance for dwelling on their own failures. If you push too hard, they will simply terminate the meeting to escape the psychological pain.
I push back on aggressive questioning tactics all the time for this exact reason. If I just sit there poking at someone's professional bruises, they're going to kick me out.
It's the Socrates problem.
Yes. We brought up Socrates earlier as the historical master of the implication question. He roamed around Athens systematically questioning the assumptions of the elite until they realized the depths of their own ignorance.
And how did the elite respond?
They held a trial and forced him to drink hemlock. They executed him because he made them feel stupid and defensive.
That historical parallel perfectly illustrates the danger Rackham identified. Implication questions are the engine of urgency, but they introduce profound psychological pain.
So to prevent the buyer from crossing the threshold into defensive hostility, you have to transition their focus out of the pain and toward the relief of a solution.
And this precise psychological pivot is the function of the final letter in this Decky Mind framework, the end need-payoff questions.
Need-payoff questions represent the antidote to the hemlock.
Exactly that. Once you have maximized the severity of the problem using implication questions, you abruptly shift the polarity of the conversation.
You start asking about the value, the specific usefulness, or the organizational utility of solving that problem.
You pivot the cognitive load from exploring the pain to exploring the payoff.
So instead of hammering the wound by asking, how much further will this turnover crisis degrade your quarterly margins, you ask a need-payoff question.
Right, like, why is it critical for your department to stabilize this turnover issue before Q3? Or, if we could implement a more intuitive interface, how would that specifically improve your daily production targets?
The source material features this wonderfully disarming anecdote from the Huthwaite research facility that cuts through all the academic jargon here.
Oh, Quincy's rule. I love this story.
Yeah, the senior researchers were locked in a conference room arguing over how to mathematically code specific questions on a transcript, debating the nuanced boundary between implication and need-payoff.
And a researcher's 8-year-old son, Quincy, is just waiting in the room. He watches them argue, walks up to the whiteboard, and points at the 2 lists of questions.
And he says, it's easy. Those ones are the sad questions, and those ones are the happy questions.
It is incredibly profound in its simplicity. Implication questions are the sad questions that explore the darkness and pain of the status quo.
And need-payoff questions are the happy questions that explore the sunlight, the joy, and the tangible value of the solution.
It perfectly captures the emotional shift. And the psychological superiority of a need-payoff question is that it completely inverts the traditional dynamic of persuasion.
Because in standard 1920s style selling, the seller assumes the burden of explaining the benefits. They say, our software is 20% faster, which will reduce your overhead.
The seller's doing all the heavy lifting. But by deploying a need-payoff question, you force the buyer to do the work.
You ask, if we could accelerate this operation by 20%, how would that impact your overhead?
And the buyer responds, well, it would instantly clear our end-of-month bottlenecks, eliminate weekend overtime, and give my team bandwidth for the Q4 rollout.
The buyer is literally vocalizing the benefits of your product for you.
The psychological phenomenon at play here is ownership. When a seller dictates a benefit, the buyer's brain naturally evaluates it with skepticism. It's a claim from an outside party.
But when the buyer articulates the benefit out loud themselves, they take psychological ownership of it. They believe it because it was generated by their own internal logic.
It transforms the interaction from an adversarial pitch into a highly collaborative, problem-solving dialogue.
And there's another massive strategic advantage to need-payoff questions that loops all the way back to our earlier discussion about the multi-call cycle.
Yes, the reality that the persuader is almost never in the room when the final check is signed.
Right. In a complex corporate matrix, you might spend weeks negotiating with the director of operations, but the final authorization rests with a VP of finance or some procurement committee.
You will be barred from that final meeting. Your primary contact must walk into that room and internally sell your multi-million-dollar solution to their superiors.
And human memory is terrible. The director is never going to retain your intricate technical specs or marketing jargon. If you just blast information at them, they can't replicate your pitch under pressure.
But if you heavily utilize need-payoff questions, if you repeatedly ask them, how would this module streamline workflow? Or why would solving this matter to the VP of finance?
You force them to construct and articulate the core arguments out loud.
Exactly. You are essentially conducting a dress rehearsal for their internal pitch. You force them to practice the exact phrasing and logic they will rely on when they stand in front of that committee.
You didn't just pitch them. You trained an internal champion to fight on your behalf. It's brilliant.
It really is. And if we step back and look at the fully assembled CV sequence, the architecture is incredibly elegant.
You deploy situation questions briefly to establish the baseline. Pivot to problem questions to locate friction and extract implied needs.
Apply implication questions to magnify that friction until the pain is massive and urgent.
And finally, shift to need-payoff questions to transition the buyer into a positive state where they explicitly state what they need to fix the crisis they just realized they have.
Which brings us to the final psychological hurdle. If you execute the CPN sequence with precision, the data reveals a paradigm-shifting phenomenon regarding objection handling.
Traditional persuasion training spends an inordinate amount of time teaching people how to parry objections like a fencer. The feel, felt, found method, verbal judo, all of that.
But Rackham's analysis of the 35,000 interactions produced a deeply counterintuitive truth. Elite persuaders don't possess superior techniques for handling objections because their methodology prevents the objections from ever being generated.
And the key to objection prevention lies in a radical redefinition of three terms: features, advantages, and benefits.
In most corporate environments, people treat those as interchangeable marketing synonyms. But Rackham defines them with clinical precision based entirely on the measurable psychological reaction they produce.
Let's break down the taxonomy, starting with features.
Rackham defines a feature as a neutral fact, a data point, or an unembellished characteristic. This server rack has dual power supplies, or this software utilizes 256-bit encryption.
And the data demonstrates that simply listing features triggers a highly specific cognitive reaction in the buyer. It generates price concerns.
Which is entirely logical. If I start listing off a dozen highly technical bells and whistles that you never asked for and don't understand, your brain immediately calculates that you are going to be charged a premium for capabilities you don't need.
The more features you list, the more expensive you sound. So, if features create price concerns, how does Rackham define an advantage?
An advantage is a statement demonstrating how a product or service functions, or how it might help a customer in a general sense.
Like, because this server rack has dual power supplies, it provides general operational redundancy.
Right. It connects a fact to a positive outcome. But the Huthwaite regressions revealed something startling. In large, complex sales, offering advantages actively creates objections.
This is the part that breaks people's brains. Why would demonstrating how your product helps someone actively trigger an objection?
The mechanism driving that resistance is reactance. You are offering a solution before you have sufficiently built up the need for that solution.
If you offer a premature advantage, the buyer instinctively pushes back because their internal value equation hasn't tipped yet.
Exactly. They don't feel the severity of the problem warrants the cost or the operational hassle of the solution you just threw at them.
So if you cheerfully say, our system automatically backs up all your data to the cloud every 5 minutes, and the buyer hasn't expressed any anxiety about data loss,
They will immediately object. They'll say, we don't need that. Our manual backup works fine, and your cloud system sounds like a massive security vulnerability.
You literally invited the objection by throwing an unprompted advantage at an unexpressed need.
Precisely. You trigger their defense mechanisms. This leads us to the final category, benefits.
If advantages cause objections because they are premature, then a true benefit must be entirely tied to something the buyer has explicitly asked for.
It's all a matter of timing and psychological readiness. Rackham defines a benefit as a statement demonstrating how a product or service meets an explicit need that the customer has already clearly articulated.
That is the crucial distinction. A statement is not a benefit unless the customer has specifically requested the capability first.
Right. If you guide the conversation using the span sequence, and the customer eventually states, we desperately need a system that ensures we never lose data during a power failure, which is an explicit need.
And you respond, our platform features dual redundant cloud backups, which ensures you will never lose data during an outage, which is a benefit.
The customer's reaction is almost universally positive. The data shows it produces overwhelming support and approval. You aren't selling them. You're simply validating and fulfilling the specific desire they just voiced.
The power of this is beautifully illustrated by the case study of a high-tech sales team in the southern U.S. Rackham's researchers were brought in to analyze a team suffering from catastrophically high objection rates.
They were constantly locked in combative arguments with their clients.
Yeah.
And when Rackham designed their intervention, he didn't teach them a single objection handling technique.
He completely excised objection handling from the curriculum because he diagnosed that the high objection rate was just a symptom of a deeper behavioral disease.
The disease was that these reps were habitually jumping into the conversation with premature features and advantages.
They were aggressively pitching before they had done the hard work of investigating and building explicit needs.
So Rackham forced them to focus entirely on the Sunshine framework. Hold back product knowledge, use implication questions to build urgency, need-payoff questions to extract explicit needs, and only then present a targeted benefit.
And the data from the aftermath is stunning. Without spending a single minute practicing how to handle objections, the team's overall objection rate plummeted by 55%.
By treating the root cause, the symptom completely evaporated.
Because if you construct the value effectively using the Espinine architecture, the customer has no logical reason to object. They've just spent the last 30 minutes convincing themselves they urgently need exactly what you are holding.
When you view the entire methodology from a macro perspective, it presents a completely coherent worldview of human persuasion. It replaces the chaotic art of selling with a logical narrative flow.
Yeah, there is no pushing. There is no adversarial tension. There is no desperate, always be closing posturing at the end.
It really demands a profound shift in professional identity. True persuasion is the domain of elite investigators and meticulous problem solvers.
You cannot bore a decision maker into submission with factual inquiries, and you cannot bully them with premature advantages. You have to systematically guide them to discover the crisis and demand the solution of their own volition.
And we know this framework operates with lethal efficiency in the real world. This isn't just academic theory.
Right, the Motorola Canada study, they ran a rigorous A/B test, training a cohort of their reps in the spend model during a severe economic downturn.
While the control group saw their new business sales crater due to the recession, the spin and train cohort increased their new business orders by an astounding 63%.
Their overall dollar volume surged by 27% compared to the control group. It might be the most relentlessly tested communication model in modern business.
That level of empirical validation really reframes who this information is valuable for. Obviously, if you're a major account executive or you deal in high-ticket B2B transactions, this is baseline.
But the hidden audience for this, the people who stand to gain the most, are the highly credentialed professionals who actively despise selling.
Oh, absolutely. The senior auditors, the structural engineers, management consultants.
These individuals view their identity entirely through technical expertise. They usually recoil at persuasion training because the 1920s-style tactics feel manipulative and sleazy to them.
And that is precisely why the SPIN framework is such a revelation for the technical expert. It does not require extroverted charisma. It relies entirely on diagnostic questions.
It operates exactly like a senior physician diagnosing a complex pathology or an engineer troubleshooting a network failure.
Highly technical professionals are actually naturally gifted at executing SPIN once they grasp the psychological mechanics. They just need to sequence their inquiry rather than blurting out the technical solution in the first 5 minutes.
If your role requires you to guide a coalition of stakeholders through a complex, high-stakes decision where failure will be public and costly, you cannot rely on charm and a slide deck.
You have to stop pitching and start investigating.
We have traversed a massive amount of psychological terrain today, systematically dismantling the foundational myths of traditional persuasion, but really we've only mapped the broader contours of Rackham's research.
There is so much more depth to explore. The nuances of how to phrase an implication question without sounding accusatory, the subtle transitions between the stages.
Exactly. So if you are listening to this and you recognize that upgrading your ability to guide complex decisions could fundamentally alter the trajectory of your career, there is a complete audio available. It's a comprehensive, hours-long exploration covering every single chapter of this book in minute detail, complete with extended case studies and highly actionable frameworks for mastering every stage of the spend sequence. If you want to dive deeper and truly internalize these skills, check the link in the description. It is the logical next step for anyone looking to strip the friction out of their negotiations and stop relying on obsolete 1920s tactics.
Mastering the psychological architecture of how human beings process risk and justify major commitments is truly a universally applicable skill.
It truly is. And to that end, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you step away from this deep dive. We've spent the last hour analyzing these mechanisms strictly within corporate boardrooms and major software deals. But I want you to apply this logic to your personal life. Think back to the last massive high-stakes argument you had with a spouse, a partner, or a close friend about making a major life transition. Maybe trying to convince them to relocate or take on a massive mortgage. When you walked into that conversation, did you just start listing off all the features and advantages of your brilliant idea? Did you try to hard close them when they expressed natural hesitation? And when they pushed back, did you try to aggressively parry their concerns with cold logic? How did that approach work out for the relationship? What if, the next time you face a massive personal crossroads, you completely put away the pitch? What if you consciously suppressed the urge to dictate the solution and instead waded into the diagnostic waters? What if you thoughtfully deployed implication questions to explore the consequences of staying in a situation that isn't working, and used need-payoff questions to help them articulate what a better future might look like? What if the secret to achieving consensus on the most terrifying decisions of our personal lives isn't about having the strongest argument at all? What if it's simply about possessing the patience to ask the right sequence of questions so that the people we love can find their own way to the answer? Think about it.
What you just listened was the beginning of a full audio, way longer, explaining every single chapter of the book. If you would like to keep listening to the end and access to the full audio, you can access it with the link down below in the description and in the pinned comment.